Hi, welcome to Pharma Salon. This is your host, Vivian Juder-Frankel. We feature discussions on regulatory, policy, compliance, and business issues specifically for the compounding pharmacy industry. The podcast covers topics related to 503As, 503Bs, hospitals, and veterinary. I hope you'll tune into all of our discussions, as you never know when and where an idea will germinate that will take your business to the next level. This week's episode is about perpetual versus continuous inventory. Carlos has seen a lot of problems and confusion with this. Pharmacists, whether they're doing dispensing with commercial or compound, it doesn't matter, he says. They don't keep track of their controlled substances where they should, and it's due to the confusing way the regulation is written. This episode has caused me a lot of hand-wringing. I really wanted to give you easily digestible information in 15 to 20 minutes, but our conversation came out much longer. I tried to look at it and see how I could edit it down, but there's so much good information I couldn't decide what to take out. I also wasn't able to break this down into 2 or 3 episodes, as I'm able to do with some others. So I'm hoping you have a nice long drive and have some time to dedicate to this episode.
So my name is Carlos Aquino. I'm the EA consultant for Pharma Diversion LLC. What I'm covering today is Section 1304 of Title 21 Code of Federal Regulation, which covers records and reports of registrant. And this is what DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, through their Diversion Control Division, and the purpose of their visit, whether it's announced or unannounced, is to A, determine that there's been no diversion of controlled substances, and B, to look at your required records. And also, with a retail pharmacy, they're looking at the security of your controlled substances because the public is in your pharmacy. And the other element is the due diligence of a pharmacy when they're dispensing controlled substances, especially for opioids, to ensure that there's no diversion of those products. So for today alone, I'm going to cover 1304, which is records and reports of registrant. And really the title that we started with was the perpetual inventory versus a continuous inventory. And if you read 1304, by the time you get done all the way from section 0.01 through 0.55, your head will probably explode because there's so much controversial statements in there that you just have to be able to rely on what is written. And this is where I come into play when I start interpreting these regulations. Now, not every diversion investigator, DEA diversion investigator, knows everything about these regulations. I do, because from day one, when I spend my 12 years in DEA diversion in Philadelphia, I always paid attention to what you are required to do in an audit, whether it's a manufacturer, distributor, importer, exporter, analytical lab, pharmacy, doctor's office, and so forth. So this is one of the areas that I really want to cover today. And it all begins with, it shall maintain the records and inventory required. Well, that's great, okay? It tells you that you have to keep one set of records to account for controlled substances in any activity. That's correct. And it requires you to maintain 2 years of records, 2 years of records for a DEA inspection. So now let's talk about these inventories, okay? One of the things that DEA diversion investigators will do is, like I said, they come in to determine that there's no diversion, but at the same time, what they will do is they would audit some of your controlled substances. Now, it used to be a time where DEA would only focus on Schedule 2s, but now they focus on Schedule 3, 4s, and 5s also. So, for example, the number 1 drug on Schedule 4 is tramadol, followed by the benzodiazepines like alprazolam, lorazepam, clonazepam. Those are benzos. And they also would focus on Schedule 3 narcotics, such as buprenorphine patches that is used for patients that are opiate dependent. So they would even go as far. I tell pharmacists all this time, every time, even your Schedule Fives, you should be looking at, your cough medicines, because there's a big market for cough medicine. Your cough medicine with codeine in it. So you on the illicit market, you can probably get about $20 an ounce for that. Okay. So there's a need for that out there. So never ever not look at your cough medicine, especially in your pharmacy. So with all that said and done, their audit normally starts with the initial inventory. Now you're required, when you open your pharmacy, you have an initial inventory, which is all your controlled substances on hand. If you're not buying this pharmacy, you're not going to have any controlled substances on your first day of business. So you would have a zero. Well, every 2 years from that date, you're required to do a DEA biannual inventory. It says at least every 2 years. You can do a biannual inventory every year. They will use your biannual inventory for the initial inventory on their computation chart. So the computation chart is two halves. The left side is what you have to account for, and the right side is what you accounted for. On the left side, what you have to account for is your initial inventory, which they will use your DEA biannual inventory, then plus all your purchases, all right, plus any controlled prescriptions that are returned back by a patient or never picked up and put back in stock. You have to also take that into account. And one of the first things they want to know is, what did you ever return back in stock, to see if you billed for that. So that's what you have to account for. On the right side, what you accounted for, DEA will do a closing inventory. Okay, they will fill out a form that says DEA closing inventory. It has the drugs, the number of containers, and total dosage units. Now, what they don't do is they don't list the controls by NDCs, a National Drug Code, which is provided by the FDA. So if you ever look in the side of a bottle, you'll see a barcode, or generally they'll have an NDC, what they'll call an NDC code. And then they'll have the pharmacy owner sign the form saying this is what was on hand at the time. Now they'll request from you is a dispensing report, what you have dispensed. And they will also take into account any expired drugs that are in the pharmacy that are waiting destruction. So if they're in your pharmacy and you have controlled substances that are expired, make sure they account for those, because if not, you're going to have an issue on your numbers. And then they'll ask you for your records from your reverse distributor, anything that you sent back for destruction. And it's either for Schedule 2s, you'll have a Form 222, or for Schedule 3 through 5s, you will have an invoice. And then also they will include any theft or loss that you've reported to DEA on a DEA Form 106. So what you accounted for includes the closing inventory, the dispensing report, records from your reverse distributor, and any DEA Form 106 that you submitted within that audit period. Your audit period will start on the date that you do your biannual inventory, and they will end on the date that they come in and do a closing inventory. So that's your audit period. So what happens when pharmacies don't do a biannual inventory correct? This is what the regulations require you to do. First page should include the name, address, and the DEA number of the pharmacy, the date on which the inventory was done, and whether the inventory was done before a beginning of business or close of business. So in essence, on the beginning of business is what was on hand at 12:01 a.m. And then on close of business is what was on hand at 11:59 p.m. Now, what happens a lot is pharmacists will do their inventories during the day. when there's already been dispensing. So they'll go into the shelf, they'll count that, but they won't add what's already been dispensed. And then they'll call it their beginning of business.
So wait, well, let's back up a second.
Mhm.
So what you're saying is they do it in the beginning, and they do it in the middle of the day, and
Right.
they put that as what's supposed to be in closing, but they forget they don't include what has been dispensed throughout that day.
Correct.
Okay.
They write it up as the beginning of business.
Mhm.
So it's say, for example, 11 o'clock,
Okay.
or at 3 o'clock, they might start doing it and they call it as close of business.
Okay.
But
close of business was 2 hours later or whatever.
Or 2 hours later, it's the pharmacy's closing, and those 2 hours you did dispensing. So now your numbers are not going to come out right. Okay.
Because at the close of inventory, it would have been different than when they opened up the next day.
Correct. Yeah. So really, the close of business, like I said, it's 11:59 p.m., not 5 o'clock, not 5 p.m. when you close the pharmacy. The close of business, according to DEA, is 11:59 p.m.
So should they be doing it after the actual pharmacy closes?
Yes, they should do that, or do it before you open.
Mm-hmm.
I have many pharmacists will come in at 7 a.m. into their pharmacy and do the inventory, and their pharmacy will be open up at 9:30 or 10 o'clock.
But if they do it at 7 a.m., they can call it the closing inventory.
No, they call it the beginning of business, not the close of business.
Right. That's what I'm saying. So at the closing of the day, you've got to do it after you close. You should be doing it after you close.
Correct.
And then the opening one, you could do it before you actually open.
Before dispensing, right? So you can call it before dispensing or after dispensing. And DEA wants to see BOB or COB on that first sheet.
So how many pharmacists did you say get caught up in this problem of doing their inventory at, let's say, like you said, 3 o'clock, and then the numbers don't add up? The numbers then don't align with the opening inventory. It
happens so many times. And believe me, when I see a pharmacist calling their biannual inventory as beginning of business, and they put the time at 11:15 a.m. Well, wait a minute. You did your inventory at 11:15 a.m., but your pharmacy opened at 9 o'clock on 9 a.m. Mm-hmm. So for 2 hours and 15 minutes, you've been doing dispensing. So you have to add those quantities to your dispensing or to your inventory report.
Right. So this is something that you're saying that trips up a lot of pharmacists. So what are the associated fines or consequences of this problem?
Well, what happens is when remember that their biannual inventory is used by DEA as the initial inventory, the first day of business. So if you counted 300 dosage units of, say, oxycodone 10-325, right? 300 dosage units, okay? Mm-hmm. But you already dispense 150 dosage units. So your inventory should have been 450, not 300. Okay. So you got to remember that the left side is what you accounted for. So he's only accounting for 300, when in reality it should have been 450. Mm-hmm. Okay. So when you look at the dispensing report will not have that. They will have it, but they won't have it because they're going to be short. Or they're going to go over. It just varies on what you put on there. So if you really had 450 on, say, January 1st, well, when you did that inventory, well, the problem is the fact that there's 150 that you haven't accounted for. And that's where your problem is going to occur, because on the other side, it's going to show it as being there and being dispensed, but you didn't count it as being in your biannual inventory. So now you're going to be short or you're going to be over, depending on how you're doing your inventory report. So what the DEA regulation in 1304, it says that for a pharmacy, you have to be exact on your Schedule 2s, and you can estimate on your Schedule 3, 4s, and 5s. So this is where I say exact count versus estimating count. Estimated means that you don't know exactly what actual quantities. So your 1,000 count bottle, you're looking at it and you say, well, I have 700, but in reality, you have 800. Now the computation chart DEA is going to do is going to show you're over 100 tablets because you only had 700 when you did your biannual.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you say that you had 800, but in reality it was 600. Now you're short 200 tablets, okay? And in the eyes of DEA, any negative number, any shortages is diversion on their eyes. And any overages is record keeping errors. So when they say you have to maintain complete and accurate inventory, at the same time, they're saying to you, well, you're a pharmacy, but you can estimate. And what I would say to you is, don't estimate. Don't estimate on your, especially on your inventory. A lot of times they have more than one bottle open. So now you might have 401 bottle and maybe 300 in the other. So what do? They just put them all together in one bottle.
And that's when they estimate, because they figure they know how much is in each bottle.
Correct. Yeah. Instead of, okay, if you're going to have 2 open bottles, right, and you got 200 or 300, and you got a counting machine there, pill counting machine, put them through the pill counting machine and come up with your quantities. You're not going to ruin the quality of those controls. Make sure in your counting machine, you should always wipe the tray before you empty your bottles into the tray. And what the tray does is it takes into consideration, it starts counting the number of tablets, and then it comes down to a lower tray that you can put on the side until you complete inventory of what's in that bottle. Now you have an exact count. Okay, so if you maintain a complete and accurate inventory, your results are going to be that you have zero difference. The other thing I see with this biannual inventory is that the first pages you cover with all the information you need. Then you have to put in your Schedule 2 inventory, right? Separate from your Schedule 3, 4s, and 5s. So what I would tell pharmacists is do your cover sheet, do your Schedule 2s, include your expired drugs on your Schedule 2s. You can identify them as expired. And then you put in a sheet and then put in your inventory for your Schedule 3 through 5, and then do a last sheet that says end of the inventory. Now, this is the other area where they go wrong. When they're doing the inventory, they're looking at oxycodone 10325, 400 or 350. They're not saying the quantities of that container, but the regulation says you're required to provide the drug strengthened form, the quantities of the container, the number of containers you have, and total dosages in those containers. And that's what you should do. Many a times, wholesalers will have that information. You can ask them. If not, do an Excel spreadsheet. I have them. I provide pharmacies all the time with the Excel. So you have your drug strengthened form, the quantities, and I'm sorry, the NDC. Don't forget the NDC, the quantities in the container, the number of containers, and the total dosage units of the containers. So if you have 100 count and you have 4 containers and you had 350, that means that you have 3 sealed containers and 1 container in counting 50, having 50. That's what you have. And it's so important to put the NDCs down. And I'll tell you why, is because A, you're required to put that information in there. But B, if you commingle all your oxycodone 10325s, when DEA does an inventory by NDCs, now what happens is you don't know how much of what quantities for a particular NDC you have. So a pharmacy, what they do is they will use one NDC, but bill for another NDC. instead of going into the computer and changing the NDC, they don't. They just leave it there, but use another NDC. So when DEA is doing it by NDCs, now you have a shortage of one NDC and an overage on the other NDC. Now you got two violations. Not only are you short, but you're over. And that's usually the issue in the pharmacy. I always tell people to use barcoding. Barcoding, you can never go wrong with barcoding. Again, don't estimate, because if you estimate, when DEA does a computation chart, when they audit your controlled substances, especially on your Schedule 3, 4s, and 5s, you're going to have an issue. And the same thing.
What happens if they point it out and they say there's a problem? You say, but the regulation says I can estimate. What do they say?
Yeah, but then they use famous word. You have to maintain a continuous inventory.
I was going to say, I'm still confused on the difference between perpetual and continuous.
Right. In the regulation, it says every inventory in 1304.04, it says every inventory shall contain a complete and accurate record of all controlled substances on hand on the day of the inventory is taken, and shall be maintained in written form. But with that saying, in 1304.21a, it talks about that you're not required to maintain a perpetual inventory. So in 1304.21a, it says you have to maintain an inventory, but it tells you that you don't have to maintain a perpetual inventory. Well, if you want to have a complete and accurate inventory, you have to have complete and accurate. You can't have a perpetual inventory.
So you're saying basically the regulations are totally contradictory.
Oh, absolutely.
So just to be safe, stick with exact inventory.
Yes. And it reads this way. Every registrant required to keep record pursuant to 1304.03 shall maintain on a current basis a complete and accurate record of each substance manufactured, imported, received, sold, delivered, exported, or otherwise disposed of by him or her, and each inner liner and seal inner liner and unused and returned mail back packages, except that no registrant shall be required to maintain a perpetual inventory. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean it's okay to not worry about your controls? You can estimate? No, I wouldn't do that. I would maintain a perpetual inventory, because when you maintain, whether it's electronic or paper, a perpetual inventory, what you're doing is, and especially if it's electronic, and a lot of times pharmacists don't know that their software can be linked with your supplier's software, where whatever you purchase, it goes right into the dispensing software or the prescription software. So it'll always give you the count. When you fill in a prescription, you can always determine what you have on hand versus what the inventory says you're supposed to have. Now, what happens a lot is a pharmacy is the only one that can have a loss versus a significant loss, especially when you're counting by hand. Sometimes prescriptions, if it's supposed to have 100 tablets, may have 98, or they might have 102. So this is why it's so important for you to maintain a perpetual inventory. And when you maintain a perpetual inventory, you're always going to know how much you have on hand. But if you don't maintain it and you do that biannual inventory, you have no idea what you're supposed to have on hand. You're just putting down the quantities that you have at that moment, but it doesn't tell you that you might be short 1 or 2 tablets, or you might be short 100 tablets. And this is why I always say, forget about estimating, and yes, do a perpetual inventory, because a lot of pharmacies, what they do is they keep it for Schedule 2s, but not 3, 4s, and 5s. So I always tell pharmacists, well, if you have no idea what you're supposed to have on hand, your technicians, your pharmacy techs, and your other pharmacists know you ain't keeping a record. So they can take 100 tablets and you will never know the difference. And this is why tramadol is, to me, the number one drug on Schedule 4 that is diverted, because pharmacies don't have any inventory, or they're estimating and they really don't know the actual quantities. And when you're doing it on a biannual inventory, you have to do an exact count, even if it takes you a bit of time, but you have to do an exact count because DEA is going to use that as their initial inventory. And you're either going to come up short or you're going to go over. And like I said, being short, it's diversion in the eyes of DEA. Being over, it's record keeping. And the violation, the fine for a record keeping violation, a civil fine, it's $15,691. So
it's a popular number. I remember you going over this for the waste management.
Right. Well, the thing is, I was just on the DEA diversion website, and I looked at the 842. It's Title 21 United States Code 842. That's the civil fine. And A5 is for controlled substances. A10 is for your pseudoephedrine products. And what talks about that you have to keep accurate records, or your failure to maintain complete and accurate records. And the fine is still listed as $10,000, but it's not, because what happened back in 2016, what they did is they started adding more because of the cost of living factor. So it went from $10,000 to now it's $15,691. Keep that in mind. So for every one of those drugs that you're over, and for each one of those drugs that you're under, multiply that times 15,691. And that's the civil fine that occurs. And and usually the civil fines come through the local U.S. Attorney's office. Now, administratively, DEA can do a letter of admonition or a memorandum of agreement, but the violation is complete failure to maintain complete and accurate inventory. And then, because you have no idea what you have, now you fail to maintain an effective security program to prevent the theft and loss of controlled substances. Because if you have no idea of what you have on hand, therefore there is no security. And that's the second charge. Multiply that times 15,691. I've done many computation charts, just like DEA does. And I find sometimes that it's really ugly. When you have a pharmacy losing 60,000 or 62,000 dosage unit over a 2-year period, there's something wrong there. Yeah. And the reason why many times is they're not keeping an accurate image.
Is it because of the estimation, or is it because of what you had illustrated earlier, people taking their inventory in the middle of the day versus closing and opening?
That too, but when you get to 60,000, most likely is you weren't keeping an inventory at all. You have no idea.
And then there was major theft going on.
And that there was major theft going on because you weren't keeping an inventory.
Right.
And if you're estimating on the estimated part, or when they do the computation, you're over by 120 tablets. Well, you dispensed 10,000. So most likely it's going to be less than 0.5%. I normally say, listen, on something like that, I would attribute that to the manual dispensing. Or if they're short, it could be because they added too many tablets in a prescription. Or if they're over, it's because they didn't add the quantities of the required dosage units in a prescription. Less than 0.5%, I would attribute that to. But if you start talking about 5%, 10%, I mean, I've seen as far as 62%.
Wow. Okay?
I know. Then I was like, wow. I had to go back, and I did that computation 3 times. I got the records out again and went through it.
And what did they say?
Oh, I didn't know. I didn't know. That's what he said. I didn't know that they were stealing.
Are
you know.
there, you know how the FDA publishes 483s and certain companies can go all through all the 483s and find trends? Does the DEA publish any kind of information on citations?
No, they don't. They maintain that as in-house information. They don't provide it to anyone. The only time they announce anything is because they have to do a federal register announcing, okay, the revocation. So if you go onto the DEA diversion website and you look up cases against doctors, it's on the right side of the website, down in the middle. It's not only revocations of DEA registrations for physicians, but there's also manufacturers, distributors, researchers, clinics, and pharmacies. And many a times it's because of the due diligence, the dispensing in not complying with the corresponding responsibility of a pharmacist when they're filling prescriptions. In essence, they become pill mills.
Yeah.
And you'll see that. And usually, many a times, you'll see that with the idea that they weren't keeping a good inventory at all, especially for an internal theft. Forget what the regulation says about estimated count. Don't. Because what's going to happen on the other end of that computation chart, you're either going to be over, which is a record keeping violation, or you're going to be under, which is a diversion in the eyes of DEA. There's a theft here because your numbers are a negative number. Then that's when the civil fine comes into play. Or it can be an administrative action taken by DEA, which means that they gave you an opportunity before, now they come back and they find the same violations. Now they go into an order, show cause, to take, to revoke your registration and with the allegations. But I do so many pharmacy thefts. I mean, you would not believe. I mean, I'm going down. This month alone, I had 1, 2, 3. Just this month alone, right now, I have 3. I got 2 that I'm going down at the beginning of December, 2 pharmacies that had thefts, and I'm waiting for them to give me the information I need so I can do a computation chart. And generally what happens is the DEA would do a closing inventory, so they provide the registrant that copy, and the registrant has a DEA biannual inventory, so I use that as the initial inventory. Then all I would need is dispensing records, purchases, and anything that they send back to the reverse distributor for destruction, or any theft or any loss on the 106 DEA form 106. And then I do a computation chart. The other thing is when they're doing the biannual inventory, you can't believe sometimes what I see. I see a white sheet of paper, they write the drug, and then they do a number in green or they do a number in red. What does that mean? Well, it means that red, they're short, and green, that they're over. And then they use that as the format to give to DEA. So DEA looks at the sheet, looks like a Christmas tree. It's a white sheet with green and red all over it. And I tell pharmacists all the time, that's your worksheet. Take that sheet and put it in an Excel format or write it out nicely if you want. Make sure you keep your Schedule 2 separate from your 3, 4s, and 5s, and put in the amounts. Do it as what DEA regulation requires it. Don't give DEA the green and red sheets, because now they're going to say, okay, what does red mean? Oh, I was short. What does green mean? Oh, I was over. Okay, very good. Now they're going to take each one of them, multiply times $15,691. And that's what you're looking at. And then on top of that, you're also going to be cited for not having a biannual inventory in the format that DEA requires. So throw in another $15,691. So your checkbook, and I tell pharmacies all the time, I just did one for a pharmacy group Saturday. It was funny. I had about 100 pharmacists out there. And I tell them, when I said to them, don't give DEA your Christmas tree, I explained them what the Christmas tree was like. They were laughing, and they all knew. And some of them are nodding their head, like
going, that's what they do.
Yeah, that's what I do. And they'll take the sheet that they used it and just put the information that's required, but they commingle their Schedule 2s and their 3, 4s, and 5. So remember one thing, it's perpetual inventory versus continuous inventory. DEA says you're not required to maintain a perpetual inventory, but you are required to maintain a continuous inventory. And then the other thing is an exact count versus as an estimated count. All right. DEA says you can estimate for Schedule 3, 4s, and 5s. But when you estimate, you're going to be short on your estimations, or you're going to be over.
Right.
Now you have overages and shortages. Multiply that, each one of them times 15,691, and that's your count. So remember, exact count, yes. Estimated count, no. And perpetual inventory, yes. I don't care what DEA says, all right? You're required to maintain a continuous inventory, which is a perpetual inventory.
Thank you for listening. At PharmaSalon, we produce content and conferences for the compounding pharmacy industry that focuses on learning through conversation. It is our mantra that everyone's experience is worth hearing and can benefit from someone else in the industry, and we're the ones to facilitate those discussions. Check out our website, pharmasalon.com/compounding, for updates on our latest events. We're introducing podcasts for CE credits. Subscribe on your favorite podcast player for updates on our latest episodes.